your support. And I want to move on to our final segment. Your support makes possible the kind of radio show we do every week on WBAI, the Independent News Hour, news and public affairs, but also the chance to talk about deeper trends in the history of New York City. And today we are joined by historian Jonathan Ezra Goldman, author of the recently released Hidden Histories of Jazz Age New York, From the Suppressed to the Strange. Jonathan, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us today in studio here at 388 Atlantic Avenue.
Hey, John, it's really nice to be here on the Independent News Hour, and I do want to say something about WBAI since you gave that great pitch and that great description just then. When I was a kid riding around in the car with my parents, they'd be flipping through the radio stations, and they'd hit on WBAI, and they'd look at each other and say, "Oh, the commie station," which I consider a badge of honor that I'm on it now.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, it's so great to have you here, so let's talk about this book. What inspired you to write it? What about the 1920s? Of course, was an era, the Great Gatsby, Prohibition, speakeasies, the beginnings of the Harlem Renaissance. But your book uncovers much more than that. So, I guess talk about. What inspired you, both the kind of the romantic image we have of the 1920s and what else you wanted to bring forward?
Well, yeah, I was studying the 1920s as a literary scholar, and more and more I got interested in the historical archive that I would use to support literary arguments, so that I got really interested in writing about the historical material itself. And two things that really jumped out at me the deeper I got into it was the ways that those myths of the 1920s as a time of ballooning wealth and expanding freedoms really obscured some of the historical reality of what was going on the ground. And also the way that so many of those obscured stories, as I started to unearth them, stories that didn't fit in with the way we sort of the myths of the 1920s, so they got pushed to the side. So many of those obscured stories do in fact resonate with today's concerns, or they shed light on current developments. So I'm talking about big things like the tremendous immigrant backlash of the 1920s, rooted in white supremacy. And that was nationwide, but it was very much supported in New York. To things that are much sort of, we think of as much less weighty import, like the fight for public space or traffic. And then everything in between. The fact that Jim Crow was that New York was a Jim Crow city is something we don't usually think about when we think about the 1920s. The fact that there was this tremendous anti-Zionism movement in the 1920s is something that has definitely been lost and rarely discussed. In New York City itself, is
getting a second look these days, including for many Jewish people who cannot tolerate what Israel is doing anymore.
Yeah, and in the 1920s, we have our forebears of that from both the Jewish New York population and the Arabic-speaking communities that was sometimes that was focused around the area that was sometimes called the Syrian colony, which really had two spots, and we're actually sitting in one of those spots right now.
Right here on Atlantic Avenue, Little Syria, and also down where the World Trade Center was later built.
Right. Yeah. Those are the two enclaves of the Arabic speaking community. They had newspapers. They had record labels. And there was an organization founded in 1917, so I'm going to just go right into this, called the Palestine Anti-Zionism Society. And that was founded mostly by a guy named Fuad Shatara. He was working with Najib Katiba and some of the other important figures from that community at the time, Amin Rouhani and Philip Hitti. And from 1917 to about 1921, they were very active in going around promoting the idea that the Zionist movement was, in fact, a form of colonialism, and that it didn't make any sense, and that it was, in fact, it countered some of the principles of the League of Nations that were being discussed discussed internationally at the moment. And Shatara, in fact, was...
And Israel continues to violate international law almost daily at this point.
Right, and of course there was no Israel at the time, but there was recognition among, again, it was both in the Jewish community in New York and the Arabic-speaking community in New York. That was from various places. Various places that are different countries now.
Yeah.
That this anti-Zionist movement had a lot of force and a lot of weight. And Shatara himself went to D.C. to testify in 1922 when there were hearings in Congress. There was a congressional resolution to support the Balfour Declaration, and Shatara was there as an opposing voice, and so was, for example, Rabbi Isaac Londman, who was a rabbi in Queens in New York at the time.
Yeah. No, I mean
also testifying against support of the Balfour Declaration, also testifying from an anti-Zionist perspective.
Right, and the Balfour Declaration, which was declared by the British in 1917, really opened the door for the colonization of Palestine.
Right, that's
the movement.
Right, that's the connection there. Yeah, absolutely.
And now, you were alluding a few minutes ago that, of course, the 1920s was a time of intense nativism and immigration restrictionism. Of course, we are living through another moment like that, at least coming from the federal government. New York, Mayor Mamdani and most of the politicians in this city, and I think the general public, thinks of contemporary New York as a sanctuary city. Can you talk about in the 1920s when you had that incredibly restrictive the Reed-Johnson Act of 1924, which basically cut off most immigration to this country outside of a few northern European countries. How did New York respond to that? How did the immigrant enclaves respond to it, as well as the more white European or northern European-minded people of the city?
Right. Well,
did they think of themselves as a sanctuary city, or were they into this crackdown?
There was a lot of white supremacist action in New York City at the time, including the publication in 1920 of Lothrop Stoddard's The Rising Tide of Color, which was one of the most important documents promoting this idea that the white race was under threat and needed to keep down the other races for its survival, which is something that obviously a document that has resonated for a century. There was a white supremacist newspaper in New York City, a weekly newspaper in New York City, and there were people signing up to join the KKK in New York City itself, which is, again, something we don't usually think about. We think of the KKK as mostly operating in the South.
Donald Trump's father, as a young man,
1927,
joined the
yeah. He was arrested in 27, at a rally. But before that, it was the early 20s that the KKK was really taking hold in New York City, and apparently they signed up 34,000 members, and there were threats in situations where black people were moving into white neighborhoods, they would get threats from the KKK not to. And then a major event happened when the KKK attacked Columbia University, when there was a black law student, Frederick Wells, who had moved into a all-white dorm, and there was a petition to have him removed that failed, and then the KKK came and burned a cross on the quad in front of the dorm and ran through the dorm hallways yelling for him and yelling the N slur and saying they were going to get him. And thankfully he barricaded his door and no one pushed their way through. And the Columbia University administration refused to investigate the next day. They said, this was outside agitators. So it's sort of a familiar story to anyone who's been watching what's been happening with Columbia and ICE over the last 6 months or so.
Right.
There's been this sort of quiet complicity with the federal administration. I mean, not quiet. This is out loud complicity with the federal administration and quiet complicity with ICE.
And Speaking of the Klan, all this intense racism in the 1920s, how the black community responded, everything from the beginnings of the Harlem Renaissance. You also had Marcus Garvey and his movement. Can you kind of summarize what that looked like?
Well, summarizing that's hard because there were so many things happening. But some of the things I point out in my book are, again, we tend not to think of. We like to think of New York as a place where there has always been a degree of enlightenment more than in the rest of the country. And I think when we look around at New York today, yes, we have a democratic socialist mayor. Yes, we are recently making progress electorally. But there's definitely an undercurrent of resistance to that throughout New York City, right? I mean, I think all you have to do is go to a school board meeting, and you will hear lots of dog whistles and lots of anti-immigration rhetoric and lots of racist rhetoric. That's just one place. I think it manifests itself. So the point is, it's important to me in this book to look more squarely at New York City's history and remind people that, in fact, in the 1920s, New York was severely segregated, and black people were not allowed in many zones of entertainment, for example. And
and Harlem was sort of the risque place that white people went to.
And even in Harlem, there were segregated clubs, like the Cotton Club, which was famously where black customers were not welcome. And the story I talk about in my book where this really manifests itself is the story of Hart Island, where Solomon Riley tried to build a black amusement park for black customers because black people were not allowed in the amusement parks of New York City. There were a bunch of them at the time. They were all over the coasts of Queens and Staten Island. And black people were not allowed in, or it's actually a little hard to find the exact parameters. It seems like in some cases they were allowed in certain times, certain days, but they were segregated amusement parks. And Solomon Riley spent a couple of years and a lot of money building an amusement park on Hart Island, which is up in the northeast corner of the city, where the East River is turning into the Long Island Sound. And there were a lot of public objections to this. And finally, the Board of Aldermen, which, by the way, was led at the time by a guy named Fiorello LaGuardia, the Board of Aldermen shut the project down with 2 weeks to go, with 2 weeks before it was supposed to open, when it was completely built, and condemned the land. So Solomon Riley couldn't open the amusement park.
Yeah, we have about a minute here, so unfortunately, before we have to wrap up, I guess what did I mean, obviously you have a whole book here, but any quick highlights of what you found in your research that is maybe particularly inspiring or thought-provoking for our current moment?
There was progress being made, of course. I mean, the 1920s were very much a one step forward, one step back sort of moment in New York City. And there are a lot of figures who were pushing and working and fighting. And there are too many of them to mention right now. The last thing I do in my book is sort of give a roll call of all the figures I find inspiring. So it's hard to single one out of that list. But Solomon Riley, who I was just talking about, he was one, and Fouad Shatara, who created the the Palestine Anti-Zionism Society, he was one. So those are a couple examples.
Okay, well, good reason to pick up the book, find out more the full roll call of pioneers in the 1920s, and you meet many other characters in The Hidden Histories of Jazz Age New York, From the Suppressed to the Strange by Jonathan Ezra Goldman. We thank you for joining us today in studio here at WBAI.
Thank you so much, John.
Yes. And so one more time, please support WBAI. Please support in the name of Independent News Hour, 833-WBAI-NYC, 833-WBAI-NYC, or go to buddy.wbai.org. And our outgoing song for today is Somebody's Wrong. And thanks to board operator Reggie Johnson, also help from Renee Feltz, Nuriel Vera de Graaf, and Boris Ekman.
I dive to the bottom and